Our question for Al Bielek is to describe what you remember about those 6 weeks that you spent in 2137 and perhaps implications of that experience for our immediate future.
Well, it's really what you just asked. The question was really two parts, but I will give it to you in terms of the way you asked it. The first part, what is the implication of the 6 weeks there? Detail, there's not a great deal of detail I can recall on that, other than the fact that I was in a hospital bed for 4 weeks and in the hospital itself for another 2 weeks, with Duncan in a bed adjacent to me. And this, of course, is after we jumped off the Eldridge. And the first 4 weeks basically was physically recovering from the damage which had occurred, which were, at that time, little was known about this problem, but it is known now. If you go out into space or even a hyperspace, there are all kinds of radiations out there which can be highly damaging to the body. And that's exactly what happened to us. We had no protective suits on, no protective clothing, and when we arrived in 2137, as they told us, we were in pretty bad physical shape, that we had been severely burned in our trip through hyperspace, space, or whatever the term was they used. And they had to have us recover and put us back together, as it were. There wasn't physical damage in the sense of an injury. There was damage in the sense of radiation and what the radiation did to the physiology of the body. But while there, of course, watching TV, as it was TV, and they had in this hospital room TV sets, and one for me and I guess one for Duncan.
Were they a little different than the kinds of TV sets we know now in the year 2000?
Very little different. They were color TVs. There were screens mounted on a swivel unit up on the ceiling, so you could control the angle at which it was down and the direction in which it was swiveled towards you, so it would be aimed straight at you. The sound could come out of the ceiling speaker or it could come from ear sets, whichever you preferred. And there was program selection. You had an automatic control for that, just like we have remotes for today.
Do you recall what TV programs you watched?
Mostly, I think what one would call current history for that time. News talk, historical stuff, geographical stuff, and soap operas as we know them today. I don't recall there was a single one on the air. There was much more in the way of an educational channel than anything else. It wasn't entertainment as I saw it. I do not recall that there was an entertainment channel per se, because at first I didn't know where we were. I didn't know what had happened. And eventually I started seeing some very strange things on TV. I started asking questions. And the first thing I noted was references geographically to the United States, and I noticed severe changes in the coastlines and the interior, and the fact that Europe didn't look at all like when I had remembered it. And I started asking questions. What's happened? What's been going on? That's when they said, I want to see maps of what's happened and some description. I said, it looks like there's been major earth changes. And I said, yes, there have been. It all happened in the period between the beginning of the 21st century and basically the year 2025. All right, what happened? So they told me, they showed me maps, and did describe it briefly. The east coast of the United States was rather heavily changed, not as much as the west coast, but neither one for that matter. None of the changes I saw would fit some of the very far out maps promulgated in the late 20th century by various people such as the I Am America group and Michael Gordon Scallion and his series of maps. They were what I would consider the worst case possible scenario, and it didn't happen that way. But what I did see was changes in the East Coast, particularly when you went south towards where Georgia, Carolinas and Georgia is. The Georgia coastline going inland, so that Atlanta, instead of being about 100 miles from the ocean, was only 3 miles from the ocean. A lot of the east coast of Georgia was gone. Parts of North Carolina had been chopped off. Florida was gone completely except for the area of the Panhandle.
Was this on the TV programs that you
I
saw,
saw
or did they give you a map?
I saw this in references on the TV program,
Okay.
which they showed pictures of the coastline in reference to something else that we're dealing with. And I see this. I said, what is this? This isn't the way I remember it. So that's when I started asking what's going on, and they gave me the maps. The Gulf Coast was drastically changed. There was about a 50-mile wide swath north of where we knew the Gulf Coast to be, as it is today, in the beginning of the 21st century. And about 50 miles wide was just gone. It was underwater, which means New Orleans was gone, Houston was gone, Corpus Christi, Texas was gone as such, though it was just barely, because that's a little higher ground there. It was just lowlands that went. And I don't think it was geographic upheaval. It was just a case of the ocean waters have been rising, plus other changes. And the big change in the middle of the country was that the Mississippi became an inland waterway, and a rather wide one, all the way up to the Great Lakes, which then became one lake. Part of the original lakes disappeared, and other parts sank so that you had one large lake there, which joined with the St. Lawrence Seaway, which became a very large seaway. And the rest of the U.S., the western part, to the other side of the new Mississippi basin, if you will, was all there, essentially intact, with the exception of California and parts of Oregon and small parts of Washington. California suffered from where the San Andreas Fault came inland. San Andreas Fault cuts into California between San Francisco and San Jose. That's where it cuts inland and is no longer in the ocean, but is cutting across land. It goes down basically central California, so that when you get past Los Angeles, it winds up cutting through the middle of the Salton Sea. And much of that section west of that fault line, of the San Andreas Fault line, wound up in the ocean, not all of it. San Diego was gone, parts of Southern California was gone, but the strange part was where Los Angeles was, parts of it were still left. The coastal sections, the beach country was gone. The beach areas were collapsed, the cliffs were collapsed. But areas of the higher sections of Beverly Hills were still there. Altadena, Pasadena was still there. Downtown Los Angeles is still referred to as the island, because it was on a rock, and there's literally an island there, even now, although it's certainly not underwater, but it winds up being surrounded by water. So there were a lot of changes that way, and of course came with that, not just the geographical changes, but total collapse of the infrastructure of the United States. And at that time, 2137, there was no longer any reference to the United States as a nation, or to Canada as a nation. They still use the geographical outlines of the old states and the countries for reference. But at that time, the banks were heavily curtailed. Banking systems had changed drastically. Computers were very much in, if you will, and the government was very much smaller and streamlined, though what was still functioning was largely under military control. There was still, even in 2137, at least in the U.S., largely a, shall we say, a residual of martial law. The military was still running things. The civilian government was gone, just plain gone.
Was it, as we know, this one world order?
No, the one world order at that point was non-existent. Now, in between the period of, let's say now, 2000 AD and 2137, I had very little data as to what happened to the New World Order. All they told me was that the New World Order collapsed. They didn't say when or how or whether there was a world war in between or not. There was a war. But whether it was due to the New World Order instigating it in order to try and preserve their status or not was not made that clear to me.
So was it still the United States military that was controlling everything for the United States area, or was it just the regional military?
At that point, there's a little bit of both. It was a residual of the United States military, but it was more a regional military than strictly U.S. government military.
Did you meet any of the military people?
Not that I can recall at this time. I don't believe I did. First of all, I never got out of the hospital until I made my famous trip to the next stop. But while I was in 2137, I never got outside the hospital. My view of 2137 was through the TV screen, and other information was brought to me at my request.
So you never actually left the hospital, did you?
No.
You were in it, and were you right beside your brother Duncan at the same time?
Basically. Of course, we got up and wandered around the hospital building. after we got well. But we didn't leave the building. We were sort of, I guess one would say, in protective custody.
So have you ever asked the question, were you really in 2137?
Oh, I asked them the year. Yes, they said it was 2137 A.D. And how can this be? Well, you came or brought to us, and we're not quite sure how you got here, but you were brought to us as found somewheres, and you were in terrible physical shape. You know, we treated you as a regular, ordinary patients with unknown origins. At that time, apparently, they didn't worry about did you have Medicare, Medicaid, or the money to pay for it. This was already, shall we say, socialism of a sort. I did not inquire to that extent as to the financial status, except I did ask about banks and banking systems and financial status, and they said it was drastically changed. Yeah, there was still money, but it was not quite the same as it had been. And banks were progressively curtailed from the amount of power that they once had.
Did you notice anything different in the hospital, though, that would show that there was 137 years had gone by from today's date? Or did it look pretty much the same as today's hospitals?
It looked very nearly the same as today's hospitals. The only thing I could say was that the medical treatment was much more advanced. They used relatively little drugs or shots. There were other types of techniques that were used. What they did give us in the way of medication was not anything we recognized. Of course, I was not a doctor then or now, and I wouldn't recognize by name many of the drugs and medications they gave us. But I know that some of that stuff bore no resemblance to anything that we use today. And they did make mention of that. And he says, oh, the 20th century medicine, we don't practice that here anymore. He says, we've gotten a little bit away from that, going ahead. They did use other types of therapy, which would come under the terminology today of perhaps holistic medicine. Perhaps one could say various vibrational treatments, light treatments. Of course, if there was surgery required, they had those techniques available, much more refined than today. I did ask some questions in that direction. There was a city outside, but that was one of the things I learned in watching TV. Many of the cities that we know today didn't exist anymore. And some of them were in the status of, you might say, a museum being rebuilt as a museum rather than as a habitation.
Did you get any feel for how many people were actually on the planet at that time?
Yes, I asked that question. They said at that time about 300 million on the entire planet.
That's all?
That's all. And in the United States, less than 100 million. It's about 50.
And what happened to the 6 billion that are here today?
That is something that I never got a fully straight answer to, but they told me this, that between the World War III, disease, famine, breakdown of government, lack of transportation, the total collapse of finance, wars with the aliens, the fact that certain alien groups arrived and were rather carnivorous. They liked human flesh. There was a great deal of problem in the big cities. Most of the inhabitants wound up being, shall we say, grist for the tables of the aliens while they lasted. They did not last that long. They were eventually run out, destroyed, or what have you. But
by
not
who? Who destroyed?
By the military of the United States and the militias also. The militias got involved heavily in the act. The UN attempted to fight some of this for a while, but apparently they were overwhelmed also. And eventually the UN was troops and such. Or let's say the UN agenda, as we understand it right now of this year, fell by the wayside. There was no longer any attempt to make a one-world government. There wasn't enough left to make a one-world government of.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because we always think of the aliens as having technology that is so far advanced of ours that if they want to, they could basically do whatever they want to do. But it seems like as up to this point, 2000, they're in a fairly passive or behind-the-scenes role. But you're saying that the U.S. military actually developed technology to beat them.
We have all of the technology that most of the aliens ever had because there was a lot of cooperative effort between 1954 and the year 2000. And we back-engineered not only their craft and their drives and their weapons, excuse me, we also, perhaps one could say, forward engineered from the knowledge we acquired of the alien approaches to weapons and weapon systems. We forward engineered a few of our own. And as an example, as of now, that is the year 2000, we have particle beam weapon systems, which I might note were first noted and developed by Nikola Tesla back in the 30s, about 1935. And without going through the long history of how we came back into it, what he started out with is a basically medium power device. Today, that is in the last 10 years, has become an exceedingly high powered weapon, where they can aim it from the Earth out into space, and with one of the systems I am told they have today, they can quite literally punch a hole through a moon on Jupiter, and have done so as a demonstration or a test for the benefit of outsiders who might have the idea that they can come to Earth and conquer us and get away with it rather readily. The day was they could, not anymore today.
So what year did you get the sense that all the problems started?
Approximately between 2003 and 2005. At that time, the brief history that I acquired at that time, meaning in 2137, indicated that the New World Order was consolidating quite heavily their gains and their control over the planet. But something went wrong somewhere. Somebody blinked when they shouldn't have, or whatever it was, but suddenly erupted a war, which was basically between, as I understand it now and remember what they told me, between the Russians and Chinese on one side and the U.S. on the other, and also the Europe essentially on our side. There was an unprovoked attack with very little warning or no warning. It hit several American cities, and we retaliated.
Was it a nuclear attack?
Yes, it was a nuclear attack of the ICBMs, full bore. And whether it was a case if they were allowed to hit us first, as Clinton has said in the current era while he is still president, that if there is such an attack ever occurs, we will fully absorb it. Instead of trying to fight it out in space and prevent it from getting here, his intent is to let it hit here. That's part of the plan. In any case, they did. They wiped out a number of cities, and we retaliated because we have thousands of the missiles. They're all over. I do not know where they all are, but I know that many of these silos which have been deactivated is the tip of the iceberg. We have so many thousands of missiles buried all over the United States and Canada and other locations that could knock out all of the known sites, which, of course, I'm sure the Russians and Chinese know. The sites we still have in reserve would be more than enough to wipe them out.
Did you ever hear who was the president at the time that this attack happened?
That's a good question. I don't think I ever asked. If I remember right, that was one of the complications that occurred at the time. The current race between Gore, Bush, and of course the Independent Party, Reform Party candidate, Buchanan. Yeah, I remember correctly, it wound up in the House. The House had to resolve it.
Had to resolve the election?
Yes, because there was not 266 electoral votes for anyone. They were split three ways. And eventually, I believe they did, I think they did pull Bush as the closest to winning, and they gave him the honor, if you will, of becoming the president. That's my vague recollection now, but it was from that point on things started to come unglued, because I know from current politics, Buchanan would not tolerate any of the things that were happening now in terms of the UN and certain other aspects. Bush was thrust into it, and he became very upset when he found out what was really going on behind the scenes. He was not fully primed by either his father or anyone else. He was left in ignorance until he actually became president. Until you become the president, you're not privy to an awful lot of information, which only the president has, and he doesn't get it all either. But in any case, things became very unstable from that point on.
From the point of the actual election?
From the point of the final election results, right, and the fact that the presidency was a little bit rocky from that point on. The government became unstable, and then about 2003 came the war. And then in that same time period, from about 2003 on. Whether or not the missile attacks triggered part of this or not, I'm not sure, but the Earth changes, which have been threatening to hit, started to hit with a vengeance. For the period of about 2003 to, let's say, about 2012, there was a series of heavy earthquakes and other earth changes which drastically changed our coastlines.
What do you think actually caused these earth changes?
It is very hard to answer because I don't think even a geologist could answer that properly. They were imminent in the sense that certain of the geographical formations, such as Area 51 in Nevada, is known now to be unstable. Certain areas in Italy are known to be unstable. We've gotten that feedback from somebody who had been over there, shall we say, dealing with the Vatican for a possible removal of all of their records to a much safer place. They said that the infrastructure underground is starting to crack. And they says, we know it's going to go, and we don't want to lose the records.
Under the Vatican?
Under the Vatican. As a matter of the record, because I talked with the person who made the tour at the invitation of the Vatican and the Pope to see what they are talking about in the terms of preservation of records. He saw what they had. 18 miles of underground records and storage. Miles. Everything from Atlantis on back, as well as everything from the point of Atlantis forward. They have it.
Yeah, I believe 60 Minutes actually did a special where they got inside on some of that.
Yeah.
We're able to be shown some of that, but yes, it just goes on and on and on.
And on and on.
And it's a well-known fact.
It's a fairly well-known fact. It's not too well-known. Only one friend of mine actually saw the whole 9 yards of it and he was given specifically the tour to evaluate, can you handle this? And he was told that they wanted to move this stuff out of there. They had hoped that he would do it, and he said he was interested in doing it on an interactive basis, that whatever files and records were put into storage would be made available on computers. They did not disagree with that. But the problem was the logistics and the money. As of now, I don't think my friend still has the money lined up to do it. He wanted to do it in western Colorado, in an area that he knows is very stable. But they're talking about hundreds of millions of bucks.
Well, when did the Vatican ever have any problem with money?
That's a very good question. I've never known them to have a problem with money. Now, why they were putting him on the spot, I don't know.
So, to your recollection, you know there was some major earth changes that did occur, but the exact reason still a little bit foggy.
Exactly.
Like,
for example, Mount St. Helens blew up, of course, in our era.
Right.
Nobody knows why it did. It did. There was something unstable. Who knows what the structure below the earth is, when it is going to trigger. They know at certain areas that it will, but nobody can predict when.
Well, the type of earth changes you're talking about, a magnetic pole shift could cause something like that.
Yes.
Well, did you hear about that at all?
Yes, now that you mention it. The magnetic poles did start to shift, but the data I was given was that they were able to finally stabilize not only the magnetic but the geographic pole structure, so that with the technology was available to us even before the end of the 20th century, they could put artificial poles up at the area where the magnetic poles are now, both north and south, create an artificial pole structure to prevent the complete collapse and the reversal. And they did this and prevented their collapse and reversal and other problems it would have created, and also, as a byproduct, stabilized the geographic poles.
But it doesn't sound like they were successful.
Oh, they were successful. The poles never flipped. It stabilized that aspect of it, but other things occurred in terms of the other geographic anomalies. The major problems which developed are unknown as to why.
What about all those cities that were, say, bombed out by nuclear bombs? You know, from what I understand, is that city is, no one can live in it for hundreds of years.
Well, according to current knowledge, thousands of years, because it takes that long for the radiation to die down. There is, though, even today, technology that can reduce that radiation risk down to minimal levels in a matter of days or weeks. The technology exists, but the government won't use it, even on our waste. We have enormous amounts of nuclear waste, which constitute a very major problem, and the government will not use it. They're using it in Europe.
Why? Why won't they use it?
Politics, and I cannot give you an answer as to why they won't. Nobody can give an answer on that. The best scientists who know these techniques, some 6 different systems are available. They won't use it.
So you're guessing that the technology existed to sort of counteract the effects of the nuclear radiation in the cities. So
they can damp that out, and unless the city was totally devastated physically to the point where it isn't worth rebuilding, in which case there'd just be a slag heap and they abandon it, post a sign here and say, here was such and such city. Other than that, they can rebuild it. I know Atlanta was hit by not nuclear missiles because they wanted it to be the headquarters of the New World Order, eastern half of the United States, but it was eventually hit by ordinary shells, if you will, an ordinary bombardment, which was not successful in producing severe destruction to the city. It drove all what was left of the residents out. The military came and sealed it off, and then there was an ongoing battle between, as I remember, the UN and Patriots, in which the UN lost. And eventually, eventually Atlanta was restored. They told me about that, and they were still working on the final touches of it in 2137.
So who are the they? We've met your doctors. Who are the they that you're talking about?
Whatever was existing in the way of a government in 2137. There was a government of sorts.
No, I mean, did they actually come into your hospital room and talk to you, or are you getting this from the television that you watched?
I'm getting part of it from television, partly from the medical people and others who came in and talked with us.
Okay, but no government official or anybody. You apparently...
I cannot recall a government official per se coming to talk with us.
So you apparently, after you jumped off the Eldridge, somehow, and I guess you don't remember it, you were perhaps unconscious at the time.
We were.
Someone found you, or some group of people found you, took you to the hospital, but apparently the people in the hospital and everybody else didn't really know that you came from, what was it, 1943?
It would have been from 1943.
Right.
I do not know at this point whether they knew it or not. If they did, they kept their mouth shut. That's for sure.
But no one interrogated you, asked you any questions, said where are you from?
No, they didn't interrogate us as such. Apparently they already knew more about the history from the year 2000, actually from the year 1943 on, than we did. Therefore, it would have been a wasted effort. But we were there for quite a period of time, and...
well, how did you eventually go from this year 2000 up, back? How did you go back?
Well, we didn't go back from 2137. The next interesting step that occurred, and I still can't explain that, how it happened, as I already outlined previously, I wound up in the year 2749, was pulled up there. By what means and by whom, I do not know. 2749 to 2751, almost a full 2 years. I have no idea how I got there. Duncan was not with me on that trip. He remained behind. And as I outlined previously, I spent almost 2 years there learning about their society and civilization, the wing makers who were in back of the synthetic intelligence computer systems that ran every city on the planet. Plus, everything had been totally rebuilt, and by that time there was no government other than the synthetic intelligence computer system, and those who were in back of it who designed it and were still running it.
I mean, that's 600 years.
Yes.
Past that point, so a lot can happen in 600 years.
A lot can happen in 600 years, and did.
I'm sure. Wow.
So, from that point, I was sent back to 2137 to get Duncan, and then go back, to 1983.
Okay, so you went from 2137 to 2749, stay there till 51.
Right.
And then did you go from 51 back to 37?
Yes.
To get Duncan?
To 2137 to get Duncan.
And then once you got Duncan, then what happened?
Then we were transferred by, again, means unknown, and how this happened I can't even begin to explain because I don't know, to the incident I usually describe in my lectures, where we arrived at night in a military base next to a chain link fence with a helicopter overhead shining a spotlight down on us when we were taken into the underground of Montauk to meet Dr. John von Neumann. And at that point, we didn't even have a memory of where we had been, E2137 or maybe up to the 20th century. That was wiped. All we remembered was coming off of the Eldridge. And that, of course, later on created a great deal of confusion. on my part, I should say. And Duncan never did remember any of the other trips. He is, to this day, I believe, not remembered any part of the 2137, or of course, he would not remember the 28th century. He was not there. How those memories finally seep back, of course, is a long story of my own. But at that point, when we arrived there at the night of August 12th, or I should say the morning, about 2 a.m. of August 12th, 1983, everything was wiped for the other parts of the trip.
And just in closing, do you have any idea what technique was used to wipe your memory at that time?
Nothing. Obviously highly advanced technology, of which today we would have no knowledge.
So do you think it was the people from 2749?
I suspect it was them, for the simple reason that they sent me back, and they said, you have to go back into the past to straighten out a mess.
And how did they send you back? Was it the same type of portal that you've been accustomed to?
It was not anything like the jumping off the Eldridge and going through that routine, or the type of portal that existed there, which was a function partly to lock up the fields from Montauk and the Eldridge. It was some other type of more advanced system. I do know that the guys in the future, that is the Wingmakers, have an extremely advanced system for time travel, interactive time travel they call it, which scientists in our era, that is the 20th century, having discovered the Wingmaker site, claim we don't have. I don't agree with them. We have it, but it's perhaps very much cruder than the refinements they have in another 8 centuries.
So physically, I guess you don't have much memory of the apparatus that was used.
I have no memory of the apparatus at all.
Okay. All right, well, we'll end that there. Thank you, Al. Ed Cameron's, now Al Bielek's, journey through time started when he jumped off the USS Eldridge in 1943 during the Philadelphia experiment. Both he and his brother Duncan Cameron landed in the year 2137 and remember waking up in a hospital bed. During that stay, Ed alone traveled to the year 2749 and spent 2 years there. In this program, Al recounts his memories of that trip. Al, can you describe what the civilization was like in the year 2749?
What I saw of this civilization was a highly advanced civilization, and technologically we had floating cities, we had ground-based cities. The floating ones are anti-gravity type flotation, 2,100, 2,200 stories, like the cities are 2.5 miles high. And in retrospect, I have looked at that and it says, now how the blazes, with any of the materials that we know in the 20th century, how could they build anything that would sustain that kind of weight from the stories above it? And of course, it was explained to me at that time in the 28th century that it was very easy to explain because they had full control over anti-gravity and multiple systems of anti-gravity, in which they built platforms of every 300 floors approximately. And they would relieve the strain of the pressure from above with an anti-gravity reverse system so that the pressure from above disappeared. So that each section only had to support its own weight, and they kept adding sections as they built this city up to 2,100, 2,200 stories. And in addition, if they wanted the city to be a floating city, it was a floating city. And they would move it around from one part of the earth, if they got tired of it, to another part of the earth. They were interested in that. And I told them about the system of governing, if you will, which was a totally synthetic system, actually, in synthetic intelligence computers. They were moderately interested in that. I said they had one in each city. Whether the city was fixed, which there were fixed cities doing manufacturing and so forth, or it was a floating city. Why they had floating cities moving around, I don't know, but that was a civilization as it was then, or is to be, if you will. And I started to ask questions. I had friends there, and I stayed long enough to learn all about the functions of the city and the fact that this synthetic intelligence was a highly radioactive crystalline form structure, so far as I could tell, because I was called in for an interview, and to be interviewed you had to put on a lead-lined suit, completely radiation proof, because in the room where this computer was, where you were interviewed, which computer, if I can call it that, was a huge crystalline structure floating in the middle of the room. No physical connections to anything we could see. And it would interview you telepathically. And I was called in for more than one interview. And I gathered the structure of the society at that time was purely socialism, 100% pure socialism. Everything was free. There were no banks, there was no money. You were born into the society by your parents. Your parents could be living in a common law arrangement. They could be married. You could be raised by your parents, or you could be raised by the state.
Well, what did the computer want to know from you?
Eventually wanted to know what I was doing there and what I knew about how I got there. At that point, I didn't remember anything about how I got there. It was sort of like I arrived and became part of this city, part of the society, like I had been born in it, but which was not the case. There was some false memories involved and a huge block as to where I'd been, how I got there, what was I doing there. I sort of absorbed the place and became part of me, and I became part of it, so to speak. And one tour guide I became very friendly with, as I found out much later.
Isn't that what you were? You were a tour guide, weren't you?
I became a tour guide of sorts because I adopted this profession. Everybody was expected to get an education, a minimum education, and then, of course, contribute something to society, do something useful. Whether it's manufacturing, being a tour guide, a scientist, an engineer, whatever, manufacturing.
What did you give tours of?
The city, basically.
To
because
tourists?
People
or?
came to these cities from elsewhere on the planet, and they would like to see all of the workings, particularly the floating cities. Where did they go? What did they do? And the cities based on the ground had these transportation tubes, they called acceletrons. It was sort of like a moving sidewalk. You had one type, which was a moving sidewalk. You jump on a thing and move through the city. You can jump off where you wanted. The other was a tube type apparatus where you jump in the thing and it would propel you, similar to the Montauk operation. But it was a localized, much slower thing in which you were propelled through the tube to it's sort of like a continuous belt. You get on it and you get off where you wanted to get off. And some other part of the city. The kids used to love this thing. It was entertainment for them. And I became part of a guide for that. We took people from outside that didn't see these things very often, or from another part of the world, and we showed them around, showed them this particular operation in the city and what was in that city. So that was what the tour guides were for. They literally showed outsiders what was going on in their particular city. Obviously, not all the cities were the same. But it was interesting that there was no external structure of government other than the local government of each city. There was a city-state, if you will, i.e. each city was a rule and a law unto itself, though they all followed a common format in terms of the fact that each city was ruled by the synthetic intelligence. And as I found out, each synthetic intelligence unit was connected to the rest. So there was a worldwide network, a worldwide web, if you will. I asked a lot of questions. Well, what about war? What's that? Unknown. Well, the unit which I talked with, the particular intelligence system, we had a nickname for them. We called it the Lama, much like the Lama in a monastery.
The Dalai Lama.
Yes, much like the Dalai Lama, if you will. I asked them, well, wasn't there war in the past? They said, oh, yes, we had wars in the past. I said, that's long gone. I said, are there any armies, standing armies, or military operations, military organizations? None. No soldiers? No. No military? No. No Navy? No. No Air Force? No. No satellite system? You wouldn't answer that one. Well, do you have means in case of something like an invasion from outside? Suppose somebody from outside wanted to come in and take over the planet. Do you have means of defending yourself? He said, yes, we do. I said, what are they? He says, you do not have the need to know. But he says, we have means to defend the cities. Apparently they had, shall we say, built-in armaments, perhaps high-powered laser systems, perhaps more advanced systems. I don't know. I never found out. But they had the means to defend each individual city as such. And apparently it was never needed.
What were the cities like? I mean, were they colorful? Were they large? Were they comfortable?
Some were large, some were smaller. They were definitely very comfortable. The apartments one we were assigned to or lived in were very comfortable. They had all the modern conveniences that we know today, plus some. Food was...
What would be different
What would be different
as
would
a
be,
convenience that, say, we don't have right now?
Yeah, that says I have to go back a bit to remember that, going back to the future, if you will.
I hear you.
They had synthetic food units, I remember, in the apartments. You could have fresh produce brought in, or you could synthesize, either way you preferred. They did have restaurants, and there were, of course, stores to go shopping in. You could buy stuff if you wanted to. Buy, of course, is a misnomer. They did set up a limitation. In other words, if everything was free, a person could go out and literally grab anything they wanted. There had to be a limit against this sort of thing, of literally purging a store of everything they had because you wanted it, and wanted this, and this. There had to be a limitation. There was a form of credit, which was a rather obscure type of credit system. It wouldn't be on a monetary credit basis, but depending on your position in the society, you were allowed to have a certain comfort level, if you will. Certain things you were allowed to have to buy, if you wanted to call it to buy, to acquire. And in terms of entertainment, they had television, if I remember correctly now, they had radio of sorts. They had theater, they had many of the things which we have today, except they've been carried a little bit further. And they did have travel. You could travel to another city. They did have rail systems that covered, at least where I was in the United States. They had rail systems allegedly all over the planet, but they were not like we have them today. The rail systems were much wider. They were at least twice the width track-wise. The cars were two and a half times as wide. They were longer, and they were made out to be much more like an excursion trip, if you will, like you would go on an ocean liner on an excursion, or on a, you would take a cruise on a train, if you will. You would get on it, you'd have bands, you would have all kinds of entertainment, this sort of thing. You'd go across the country.
Did you ever see a map of the world of that time period?
Not that I recall now.
So you did at 2137, though,
oh,
right?
Yes, in 2137 I did. I did not see a map of the world at that era of 28th century. I'm sure they existed, but I don't recall that they were shown. In fact, I didn't see it because it was not part of society. You weren't told much about what was on the outside. And there were those people, the heretics as they called them, who didn't want to be part of the society, this regimented socialism, if it were. It was free to a point, but it was also regimented, because you had rules and regulations, and you were told this is the limits of what you could do. If you went outside of that, there's sort of a yellow zone. You were called in. The Lama gave you a reprimand. If you went in the red zone, it was a very serious case, like you would have today if somebody committed murder. Well, they had rules involving that kind of society, rules and regulations. And if you went outside of the normal zone or the red zone, you were called in for not just a reprimand. Many people disappeared, were never seen again. Now, whether they were eliminated on the spot or not, I can only assume that that was probably what happened to them. And they did have automobiles, so I never went out in one, and I understand there wasn't that much car travel. For those who were on the surface cities, they had to have transportation.
Did everybody look pretty much the same, physically?
There were variations in the human appearance, but the human appearance had changed a great deal in the sense that it was more refined. There was less variation in appearance than there is now. There was more of a genetic mold, which had much narrower limits than you see today genetically. I don't recall at this point in the 20th century that there was more than one race. It was Caucasian. I don't remember seeing any other races. Now, outside of where I was, because I never took any long trips anyplace, there might well have been other races elsewhere in other parts of the planet that I never found out about, never inquired. What intrigued me was the fact that here is a synthetic intelligence computer running this whole system, and we're actually running the planet. These things didn't build themselves. Who built them? That was where it got much more interesting, because eventually I was introduced to the builders of the intelligence system, the computer systems. Who were the designers? Who were the builders? That's when I met this group. They were different. They were totally human, but they were different than the ones you typically saw. They ran 6'2", 6'3", average, extremely intelligent, genetically, I guess is about as perfect as you could expect anyone to get. They were the result, as they told me, of genetic engineering that had been ongoing for centuries. And it was in the 26th century, they perhaps came from a long line of computer engineers. It was in the 26th century they decided to engage in the experiment of synthetic intelligence to see if they could run the whole planet.
Probably Bill Gates' great-great-great-great-grandson.
Very possibly. Maybe Bill Gates' grandchildren or great-grandchildren. But that was the way I was introduced to them, and that they were running everything behind the scenes. They kept totally out of sight. They didn't interfere with the computer operations unless something went wrong, and apparently there was one case of where the way the computers were programmed, as I understand it, they had a wide latitude of operation, wide latitude of what they could do, but there was one inbuilt function which was allegedly inviolate. They could never lie to anyone about anything. If they felt it inappropriate to give an answer on something, you just say, I can't give you an answer on that at this point, or that's not in your domain or whatever, but they wouldn't lie about it. One of them did lie, apparently, at one time, and one of them was scrapped and replaced. I felt there was some basic flaw in that unit that had gotten to the point where it could assume to lie, whatever the reason was, it was destroyed.
Was its name Hal?
From the famous movie?
Yeah.
Not that I know of.
Well, they say history repeats itself, you know.
Good point.
Yeah.
As I got to meet these people, I got to learn a lot more about prior history, prior to this point. And as they said, they had undergone genetic engineering themselves from the 22nd and 23rd century. And they emerged as the, perhaps one would say, the dominant intelligent species on Earth. They had a name for themselves, which I'll give you in a minute or two. But they, literally, the power behind the scene running this whole thing, and they were beginning to realize something, which I've learned since, perhaps because of their writings, which have come back to this century. There was a major flaw, which they realized was possible, from what they told me, but it was only beginning to show up in the 28th century. And that was the fact that if you have pure socialism, a set of guidelines where society must adhere to, and everything's free, you lose incentive to create. You lose that creative ability. And you just fall into the pattern, and the pattern remains unchanging. There are no new inputs, and eventually the whole damn thing will collapse because there's no reason to go ahead and do anything new. There's no reason to create anything new, and people will get tired of the same old thing eventually. And if they see nothing changing, no future, nothing that they can help to create, then that creative impulse is gone, and eventually society collapses and dies.
Well, that's very strange because, I mean, you could look to present-day Soviet Union and find the same example there. That's why communism fell.
You certainly can. Communism is socialism under another name.
Yeah, so it's odd that they wouldn't have looked back into history to learn that lesson before creating the society they created.
Well, one of the things they looked at and had perhaps as a consideration was the fact that in the 22nd, 23rd century, the world population was only around 300 million total. And there was a definite decision, and of course this is in current day's data, the New World Order feels that the ideal world population would be around 500 million. It shouldn't be over 1 billion. Their natural resources and such cannot support it, sustain it indefinitely, which is beginning to show. But as part of that assumption of this century, apparently they considered the same thing, that the maximum desirable population on the planet should be around 500 million, and they were aiming everything at that 500 million population, which is where it was in the 28th century. And it was approaching that in the 25th, perhaps, from what they told me. But they wanted to try and make a system of socialism work because they didn't want to go back to all of the evils and the problems of the banking systems, particularly private banking, which have existed in the last 10 centuries, up to this time. And they didn't want to see that repeated with everything leading into wars and fights for the sake of profit, and what it did to humanity. Well, of course, that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is it goaded humanity into advances. You create a problem, you find a solution, whether the solution is how to beat your enemy in war, or how to get out into space before somebody else does, or whatever it may be, or to defend yourself against an invasion. It creates a desire, an incentive for something which in the long run becomes perhaps productive and adds to the sum total knowledge of humanity. But they felt, for whatever their reasons and choices, that they wanted to try the grand experiment with socialism controlled by a highly intelligent synthetic intelligence system rather than by humans, because they realized if humans control this, it gets out of hand. You get an elite group who runs the show and runs it for their own benefit and their own profit, which is exactly what's going on the planet today.
So were any of these computer programmers taking advantage of the fact that they wrote the program that controls everything? Or were they...
As far as I could tell, they did not. They were really...
Because they could have then controlled the world with that
In
power.
a sense, they already did, because they created the computers, and if they found that a computer went out of its bounds of its own programming limits, they would pull it and replace it.
But they were pretty good folks then.
Apparently, they were what you might call the perfect human.
Yeah.
That's hard to say in a certain sense, but they seem to be that. They had no self-desires in terms of gaining power or control. Or
They were not
accessing
ambitious.
control. They are not ambitious.
Huh.
And it's a very peculiar thing, because they also had, separate from the main cities, they had their own culture, they had their own art, their own, I wouldn't say religious beliefs, but their own philosophical beliefs, which had gone beyond religion. Religion didn't exist, I might add, in the 18th century. It was almost non-existent in 2137.
What did they think of God, or what was their concept of God?
They did think of a supreme being, but they thought of it in a very different sense than most religions do today. Most religions today take a very narrow view of the punishing God and the rewarding God, and you do what he says, everything's fine. If you don't, he'll punish you. That's long gone in terms of their outlook. It's considered a supreme being that it is very difficult to get to know, that is beyond all of us in terms of awareness and understanding, but it, the God, learns through communicating through us and contacting us and being part of our experience, that we are part of God just as God is part of us, and it's a two-way street type thing. It's a reciprocal arrangement, if you will. And that God is beyond the physical universe as we know it, but maintains contact with the physical universe through us. And that was apparently their attitude and their religion. And you can find that information today in the network, and the net, and so forth, under the name of the Wingmakers, because that is what they call themselves. And according to what has turned up in current time, and I remember what they told me, they had made stashes all over the earth in about the 8th century A.D., which had been uncovered in the 20th century and into the 21st century. 3 have been recovered so far, one in New Mexico, which was the first one.
Well, stashes of what, though?
Of their literature, of their science, of their...
This is the Wingmakers you're talking about?
This is a buried underground, what would you call them? Time capsules, perhaps, is what would be the best thing they were, to show what their art and there was that they had, their music, their technology, and whether or not there was a warning involved, that's hard to say, because it fell immediately in the first site with the Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, fell immediately under the control of NSA.
So are you saying that these engineers, these computer software engineers...
they're human engineers as well, and genetic engineers additionally.
Okay, are you saying that they were actually a byproduct of the Wingmakers?
They were the Wingmakers.
They were the Wingmakers, okay. And the Wingmakers then are alive and well today?
They're alive and well today in the 28th century. They can apparently travel to this era, but they're not living per se in this era, meaning the 20th century, 21st century. But they built these stashes, and one of them was found in 1983 approximately in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. On the surface, there was an Indian mound and an Indian burial site, which, according to all of the geologists and archaeologists who looked at it, fitted the 8th century AD. Everything fitted except they found one artifact in there that didn't fit at all, and that's what brought in NSA. There was a compass. Indians didn't have compasses. So NSA came in, then they thought this might be an alien stash, so they put in the ACIO, which is Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization, a super secret group within NSA, with a certain secret group within that. And they couldn't find anything more than the compass, so 11 years later, they buried the thing, covered it over. I don't mean buried it physically in terms of rubble. They buried it in terms of an invisibility shield, and they totally hid the site. And about 1994, there's a earthquake in the area, a canyon wall comes down, and they find, after that they went back to check it, and they found there was an entrance into an underground cavern system with a spiral staircase carved in the solid rock and a series of 23 rooms. And this information, of course, has been made available because one of the head archaeologists involved with it decided the government had no right to keep this secret. So we put it out on the net. You know, whether he's still alive or not, we don't know, but they didn't get all the information out.
Do you know who he was?
Only by his code name, is a Dr. Alexander. That's not his real name.
Okay.
And he held a level 12 clearance in the current terminology of this century's clearance levels in the U.S. government. There's up to a level 15 and beyond probably. But at 15 was a director who was only known by the number 15. Nobody called him by his name, but he was part of the ACIO operation, and Alexander broke his, so we say, his oath of secrecy in bringing the information out and getting it put on the net. But he had to crack the codes of what they found in the 23rd room, and that was an optical disc. Standard type like we know today, except they couldn't break the code. And NSA has some pretty damn good code breakers. And there are some very good code breakers in the government. None of them could break it. Anderson went to work on it. It took him a year and a half. He knew something like 20 languages, including ancient Sanskrit.
Did you actually know this individual, Mr.
No.
Alexander?
No.
Okay, so this is secondhand knowledge.
This is based off of the manuscripts taken off the network and the interviews of him by the one woman who put this whole manuscript on the internet.
All right, this is about the internet. Okay.
Right.
I'm trying to tie this story that you're telling right now back to.
Well, I'll tie that together.
Okay.
And the information was buried at this time and era, and according to the interviews, of which 2 were on the net, they built 7 of these stashes around the planet about the 8th century AD with the intent that they be found at some time in the future when the technology caught up with what they had accomplished and done in the way of hiding sites and burying them and recognizing certain key things like that compass that didn't belong with the Indian stash. So, you know, ACI got into it. They finally realized when they broke the code on the optical disc, which gave the whole history, gave us a lot of their science and technology, which apparently was not released on the net, that this was not somebody from outside. This was a group of time travelers out of the future. And they put this stash, and that's what they said on the optical disc. We did this here. The art is strange. If you see any of their work in the manuals, I can show you a manual, but I don't need to put it in this collection because it is available on the net still, so far as I know. If it turns out it's not available, we can add it to this. But their purpose, they stated, was to guide humanity through some very rough periods. And apparently their desire at this time, in having this stash, and now 3 uncovered, which to say there's 4 more, to be uncovered essentially at the tail end of the 20th century was the fact that we face a very major crisis in human history right about this time. And this is, of course, whether we go down the road of total blatant government control, a total dictatorship, or whether we retain, as in the U.S. and the Western nations, whether we retain a institution which is really called a constitutional republic, not a democracy. And many of the nations of Europe also retain their republic status, or whether they go back to a monarchy system, or whether they go back to something worse. There is a you might say, a saddle point right at this time, at the beginning of the 21st century. Which way is humanity going to go? And that's one of the reasons the stashes were placed where we found at this time. And they're realizing that there must be communication back to this era, and there must be some kind of guidance to get humanity through a very rough period. Because they face the possibility that, because time is not frozen in a celluloid strip which is unchangeable, the whole thing throughout the entire loop, which is a time loop, is, shall we say, malleable. It is plastic. It can be reshaped. It can be changed. The past is essentially fixed. In terms of us, what is our past is essentially fixed, but it's not entirely true. It can be re-engineered and has been.
But are they coming back to make their actual present time better? Is that their goal?
Their goal is to straighten, as I understand it, and trying to put this together myself, their goal is to try and straighten out some of the problems they realize they now have in the future, because in the year 3000 AD on, apparently there's no life on the planet. 6037 AD is dead. There's no life. And this, of course, is something which is not a desirable outcome for humanity.
Okay, so they're still there in the 28th century,
Yeah.
but what they're seeing is that year 3000, or somewhere around there, life is dead.
Someplace around there, they're
Okay.
dead, whether it's because of an alien invasion or because of a collapse of our society due to...
But don't they have the ability to time travel in the future? Obviously, they
I'm
can
sure
go
they
in the
do.
in the past, so they should know what happened then.
That's one of the reasons why I believe they're coming back to the present, or will be coming back to the present, and one of the reasons why their stashes are being uncovered at this time.
Right. So this must be a real pivotal point.
It is a very pivotal point. This
The year 2000.
10 years, let's say from 1990 through 2012, or let's say 1992 through 2012, if you want to put it in terms of a 20-year bracket. Because of the information we're getting through leakage from friends of mine who have connections with the near future, saying that there will be a world war in 2003, and there will be enormous destruction. All of the people who have looked at the, shall we say, the trends of history, as well as the predictions by various sources, both biblical and otherwise, indicate a tremendous war sometime in this decade, which will be very, very destructive for humanity and not leave much.
Well, when you went to 2137, did they talk about a
Yes,
huge war?
They did.
Did they
That was
did
in
they
the
date
records.
it?
There had been a war in the 21st century, which essentially that and all the earth changes, which came all about the same time, were over by the year 2025, and from that point on they started to rebuild, but there wasn't much left to rebuild with, except they still had the technology. They hadn't lost it. Consequently, they had to start nearly from scratch, not quite. If it hadn't been for the nuclear subs with their optical discs, if it hadn't been for the fact that some cities were unscathed and had a basis of technology and manufacturing left so they could rebuild the rest of what they wanted, there would have been a much worse situation. Now, this is what I saw based on my departure point, which was 1943. Now, from 43 to now, meaning 2000, the year 2000, a lot of things have happened. A lot of people have changed their ideas, and there has been a very pivotal change in Earth's history in terms of what has happened in the last 5 years. Nostradamus, the famous seer of Virginia Beach, Virginia, and many
Edgar
others.
Casey?
Edgar Casey, and certain other people who have looked into the future have all saw a huge calamity befalling Earth in the last decade of this century, that is the 20th century, the last decade between 1990 and 2000. And many of them predicted a comet hitting Earth. Well, let us look at history, namely Hale-Bopp, 1998. Hale Bopp came in close, passed around the Earth, this speaking in terms of history as we know it, passed around the Earth at a safe distance and went on its way and split into 6 pieces after it passed the Earth. However, that's only telling the outward story. Hale and Bopp discovered it 2 years prior, and they were given credit for it because they were the first astronomical scientists to see it that were of public record. And I emphasize a public record because of the fact that it was known to the military and to NASA 10 years before that. Hale-Bopp was the largest comet ever to enter our system, and it was followed by an object behind it, which was denied by all of the media and by all of the scientific groups because they didn't want the public to know what was going on. Hale-Bopp, of course, we have good computers today, and speaking of 1997, 98, they predicted the course of the comet, of course. And the first one said pass near the Earth but around it. Then they noticed there was a course correction. And they said, oh, it's going to come much closer to the Earth. And there was another course correction. At what point, I don't know, because I have not had access to all of the records. Only a certain friend of mine who was involved in this project knew. They knew it was on a direct collision course with Earth because it was being aimed directly at Earth. And they could predict this with the computers as much as a year, perhaps, before Hale-Bopp, quote, discovered the comet, unquote.
Now, this information you're sharing with our listeners, where did this come from? Is this something that you knew about? Or
no, it comes from military sources and a friend of mine
okay.
who was involved in this project.
That was a project to
blow
up Hale-Bopp.
Montauk, yeah, which was called Operation Sky Pebbles. It was an Air Force project.